And then I need to bring up this, and I need to do this. Hey, hello, everybody. Okay, and then this launch presentation, we are going to talk about the HTML email. And there's quite a few HTML email and available right now. And the credit card receipt, that's a new one. And Jim is going to talk about today at the dinner time. And so I'm not going to touch much on that. And then we have the order acknowledgement, okay, which is currently we support the PDF version format, and then we also just add the HTML format. And the quote acknowledgement, same thing, PDF, now we add the HTML. Sell desk quote, and supported by PDF, and then the now the HTML. And we said I'd like to know maybe just a little survey. How many of you are using the sell desk right now? Well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, okay, good. Okay, Dave, some people, okay, etc. So quite a few of you still not using sell desk, okay, and then so it is something I think many of you should explore. And essentially, it's a great, how should I say, for you to take a telephone order. If your business is involved in taking telephone order, then the sell desk is a great tool, okay? And then so in sell desk, then you can also create quote. Essentially, sell desk is much easier processing than the order entry. So if you want to interact with customer over the phone, and then they ask you, do you have this, do you have that? And you answer the question, and then maybe you do, maybe you don't, or maybe you said, oh, I like that. I like to order from you. Right there, you can create an order from the sell desk very easily. Or maybe it's just an inquiry, and then nothing come out of it. But that's okay. We can save that as kind of like the semi kind of style quote. And then you can send that quote to the customer as a sell desk quote. Okay. And then lastly, shipping acknowledgement. It used to be a text version, and now we support a HTML version. Now, Cheryl, are you aware of this HTML version of order acknowledgement? You're aware of it. Are you using it? No. Shipping acknowledgement. That's a text version you are using, right? No, that one is that. No, that's for your trading. One of your trading partner. What? No. That's okay. That's related to this one, but the general speaking, your shipping acknowledgement email is text, right? Right. Okay. Yeah, there's a HTML version. Look better. Okay. So so that's basically the area of covering. Okay. Now, as you see in this slide, right? You basically, how does it work? It works by subscribing to the email. So in this case, there's a customer called BSS046. And then you go into the customer, you bring up the contact. And then there's a list of contacts, and then you highlight any one of the contact. And then in the contact, and then there's the web tab. And then you click on the email doc button. And then it will say, okay, for this contact, you know, does this contact want to receive any PDF post office email document, or does it want to receive any HTML email document? So by default is all turned off, by the way, okay? And then, but if anybody specifically, if any contact basically saying that they raise their hand and say, hey, I want to have it. Then from that point on, say, for example, you say order acknowledgement, you turn it on. And for this contact, then from that point on, every time when you create the order, you send out the order acknowledgement, this particular contact will receive it. So you can subscribe at the customer level, you can subscribe at the ship to level, you can even subscribe at the salesman level. So the salesman level is actually requested by Avi, okay? And then, but the Avi, the PDF post office, right? The ability to subscribe to PDF post office at the salesman level, that was a request from you, right? Do you remember? No, I'm just ask you to, you do remember that adding the salesman ability to subscribe, right? It was actually for your request, okay? So then within the ship to and customer and the salesman, any one of the e-contact in there raise their hand and say, I want this document. From that point on, when we send an email to that customer, that contact will get it. So they need to specifically raise their hand and say, I want it. But if you add a contact to the order, then by default, that contact will get it. Okay, because when the contact adds to the order, that means meaning order contact, right? And of course, he or she should always get it. But not in the customer, not in the ship to, not in the salesman. Those areas you have to specifically, say yes. So this is basically explain that if it's an order contact, yes, by default. If it's a customer contact, then by default, no. Unless you specifically specify ship to, same thing, salesman, same thing. Okay, so that's basically the multiple source of the e-contact can receive the email. And then, so this is an example of the credit card receipt. Okay, look much better. Hey, by the way, how many people are using Elliott credit card feature? 1, 2, 3, 4. How many of you are currently charging credit card but not using Elliott credit card interface? Well, you are using Elliott credit card. Yeah. You are, but I said charging credit card but not using Elliott credit card solution. Okay, I need to work on 2 of you. Okay, so so this is an example of order acknowledgement, okay, and HTML format. And as you see, this is actually receiving Outlook email, right? So if you print out this Outlook on the printer, yeah, it's basically right there, your order acknowledgement, okay? And so you can send out order acknowledgement, okay? 3 different formats right now, okay? You can send out the HTML version, which is only supporting 8.6. You can send out the PDF, since we have supported since earlier 8.2, so it's been some time. And or you can send out the text version, which is basically way back, okay, long time ago. And you can do it interactively or batch. Interactively meaning you create the order. Citizen say, would you like to send the email? And then you say yes, okay, you go, right? Batch mean you want to use some kind of a deferred processing and then say, every 1 hour, I want the order acknowledgement go out automatically. And then so you just do the batch processing, constantly monitoring, or you do it once a day, etc. And then sending out multiple email, okay, for that day. So you can do interactive, you can do batch. This is a quote acknowledgement, which is very similar like order acknowledgement. And cell desk quote. Again, as I said, cell desk is the easier way to enter the order. Or a quote. Shipment acknowledgement. So this used to be a text version. But right now we also support the HTML version. I think, Cheryl, your customer would like to have something like this. What'd you say? Okay, 8.6. Which I know you are already 8.6, right? Mostly. Oh, okay. So shipment acknowledgement option, this is not interactive, so this is a batch. Okay, so you usually do it through the deferred processing, and then every night, deferred processing run, then the email pick up instant. And we can send out through either the order database or through the invoice history database. And the format right now support the HTML version as well as the text version. Okay, so you want to know more how to do this? You just do a search on our knowledge base for HTML email, and then you get a whole bunch of knowledge base article about them. All right, so I'm gonna risk myself to do a demo, see if I can make it fail, okay? So the first I'm going to bring up Outlook. And I probably should do this earlier because I'm pretty sure I'm going to have a whole bunch of junk, okay, in my Outlook. All right, so we got quite a few. So what I'm going to do is I'm gonna using LA 8.6. All right, so I will go to custom order processing, and then so first let's go to the global setup and make sure we are setting up to do that. So I'm going to go to global setup. And I'm gonna go to the print order acknowledgement, etc. And so first it said, do I want to print order acknowledgement default with a phone? And I say yes. And default phone 60, I guess that's fine. Okay, I don't know what it is. Okay, and then so, and okay, and print order acknowledgement default with phone, yes. Print immediate order acknowledgement, say yes. Okay, so this is all setting look correct. And so now I need to say, oh, this is the format. I need to do the HTML format. That's the shipment. Or the header. I think I need to go to the no, actually, I'm sorry, wrong place. Enable before email. And then I want to use this as a HTML email. So that's a flag I need to do. See, the thing is this, okay? Because this project has been done for a while, right? Even I don't remember the flag that well. So if you go online and then find the document, and it will tell you exactly the step to go through. So this is an example that if I look at my online document, it will actually help me to do this demo. What did I do? Okay. Now, so so that's setting me up to, oh, this is 96. I don't want to do 96. I want to do 1. So let me go back again and then go to the global setup. And print order quote IMA. And number 4, yes. And I'm going to make it default email. And I'm going to make it as a HTML version. And number 5, yes. Okay, this is, wow, this is 48. I don't know what I mean, but that's okay. And then so, then we're done with the setup. Now the question is, will the person receive the email or not, right? So in this case, I'm going to use Nestlin as the so as you can see in this example, right? Jim will receive the credit card receipt. Ed will receive the credit card. Ed will receive what? Ed will receive, right? He will receive the shipment acknowledgement. But I really want to say order quote and whatever, okay? So I want him to get all of this, and I'm gonna save it. So then from this point on, okay, and double make sure. Okay, email. Okay, so he's good. So Edward will receive the HTML version of the organ acknowledgement. So then the next thing is this. If I go to enter order, okay, so this is Edward conference testing, and for Nestlin. And let's say, what does Edward want? Edward would like to order a credit card terminal. Costs this much. Okay. And I can also, let's say, add a bit no. Okay, and I will say this. Order. Maybe why don't we just say make it invoice, okay? Edward, thank you very much for your order. I will I will call you to set up the device after you got it, okay? And that's self, something like that. So I said, save it. And I said, go ahead, print the email immediately. Oh, do I want to print the invoice immediately? I don't want to print the invoice immediately, but I didn't send a code because this is an I type of order. So my mistake. Test order ACK. Well, it's just basically telling you that I didn't script this one, and then that's the, this is a live demo without scripting. Let's order this guy. And then, so I want to add the word nice. Talking to you will call you to set up. So no. Okay, so you asked me, do I want to send the immediate acknowledgement? I said, yes, I want to email it. Okay, and then this is the email. Okay, and then I'm just gonna say send. So oh, it's gonna send to Roger too, and it's gonna send to Jim as well. Okay, and then so well, actually, the easiest way to see the email that we just sent is from your local outlet? Supposedly it's it's supposed to send out already, but I'm not getting this here yet. Okay, and it's but okay. So here's the things you can see. Okay, on what is being sent out. Okay, my bet is on this is I did not script it. Okay, to make sure this is all nice and before I do this demo. Okay, and then but supposedly if you go to this log folder, right? And you go to this log01, this is the email log. This is the email we just sent it out to Edward, right? And then so if you want to see the content of this email, okay. And I'm sorry. I didn't know where did it go, but anyway. So the email did send out, but I cannot show it to you right now because out of the technical difficulty I'm having, I apologize for that. Okay, but anyway, it's not here yet. Okay. Everyone's we just want to do a one, just do it at the order that want to do it consistently. Say that again. If you want to send off an email, right, you can either do it at the specific order, right, or you can send it under AR. Right, you can just basically add a contact to the order, right? And then you can send it out. And you can also send out manually because, for example, you can just say, I want to print this order to the PDF. And then so now it's a PDF, and then you can just say, hey, I want an email. But at that moment, you need to manually enter the email address. But you noticed earlier, I did not enter the email address, right? It just basically goes through my customer contact. And then basically, Edward raised a hand and say, Edward want to get it. And Roger raised a hand, Roger want to get it. And then, and then Jim also raised a hand, he want to get it. So I just basically send out 3 emails to 3 different persons based on the customer e-contact setup. That's the main difference is then sending the order acknowledgement manually because once you set up the e-contact to get this automatically, you don't need to worry who's gonna get it. Somebody will get it if the customer ship to a salesman is set up properly. That's the main idea behind that. Okay, and then also if you do it on a batch basis, right? And because if let's say every day you get 1,000 orders, you don't want your salesperson spending time sending out that 1,000 orders individually. Then you can have a deferred processing to just say run every once an hour, and then the email will just going out, okay, for that 1 hour period. So that's another advantage of doing this. My understanding is Outlook has something called a take back option. Okay, is in Outlook, but my understanding is the Outlook take back option, depending on number one, the other side also using Outlook. That's the first criteria. The second one is the other side hasn't seen the email yet. If the other side already seen the email, it's too late for you to take back. And so there are some limited option, but it is mostly likely you send it, then your option is limited. Okay. But of course, if that is a concern for you, right? So then the proper way to do it is you want to do it manually, because then what happened is you want to say, hey, let's print that old acknowledgement to the PDF. Let me review it first. And you look at it and say, oh, well, this looks good. Then you send it out, right? That will be manual. So the purpose of this is to automate it. So the downside come with automation is then you better make sure it works. Okay, you better make sure you enter the right data, because otherwise the automation garbage in, garbage out, right? Yeah. So yes.
So with that, say if you were doing it with the deferred batch, you could then still go in if you caught the error and just like after you entered it, you could go and delete that deferred process, or that once you set it up for deferred processing, is that something that you were able to then take back? Saying one step before you even actually get sent, just in that deferred area waiting for you to go in and edit that.
If you're setting up a defer, right, it is basically a test waiting to be ran, right? It hasn't sent it out yet. It doesn't know who's gonna get it yet. It just know, hey, every once an hour, I need to wake up and then find the potential recipient, okay? So within this 1 hour period, let's say, suppose you caught the error and you go ahead and fix it. Then the defer will reflect whatever the correction you make. So that's no problem. But what will happen is, let's say, suppose if the defer, okay, 1 hour period up, you go ahead and send out the email. And then after 1 hour, you discover there's a mistake.
Yeah.
Well, the email is already out,
yeah,
right? And then there's a very limited option for you to record it, okay? And then so that was the things I was talking about. In Outlook, there's a record option, but it's a limited, okay, option to do it. Okay. Right. 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 Right.
Or it's the output.
Right. 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 Yeah. If you have more concern with the accuracy, etc., before you send out, okay, then you probably just do your own way, okay, and then do it manually, basically. And then, but that's just basically, depending on the type of business you are in. Okay. Now, so we have an HTML email versus a PDF post office, right? And I mean, so if I want to do a comparison, the HTML email, this is only available in LEA 8.6, and then, well, we didn't really have the credit card receive this option before, so that's new, okay? And then, and then credit card receive, actually, you can modify the format, by the way, okay? And but you require some HTML knowledge, and then Jim is going to talk about that during the dinner time. And but for HTML email, we hard code it. We hard code it based on our standard order acknowledgement, code acknowledgement, shipment acknowledgement format. We hard code it, and so on the other hand, PDF post office, we have it since LEA 8.2. And the layout are actually user definable. So it begs the question, say, why do Edward spend time do the HTML email? What is the advantage over PDF post office? And then anybody know the answer? Raise the hand. Why do we spend time do HTML email since it's not user definable, it's hard code? Why do we spend time to do it? Yes or no? Okay, anybody? Yes. It looks better, partial, okay? Because PDF post office is pretty good as well. You receive a PDF, you click on it, it's professional looking, right? Like a HTML email. Anybody want to have any tip? Huh? Cannot be edited. I think PDF is kind of like you can lock it down. Say that again? No attachment. So why no attachment is better? Security, no attachment, yes? Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna give away 3 coins. Okay. Okay. And security is, I think it's a pretty good answer. Okay, and then because now did you guys notice I get this junk email all the time, right? And it claimed Edward Kwong sent to an email to Edward Kwong. Well, actually, is Edward Kwong sent to the email to accounting, and I am a subscription group of accounting. So I get this email. And of course, if you look at this Edward Kwong and his email is LV. Actually, I have no idea where is LV. Okay, it's probably a country code, something like that. Okay, and obviously this is a junk, right? And then anybody want to guess what's in that PDF? Is some kind of a virus, firmware, some kind of ransomware, whatever things that can harm your system. That's what's in those PDF, okay? So PDF, okay, well, it's wonderful, but PDF can also run macro language, which is a program, right? So the hidden spyware, okay, and then ransomware or whatever, the virus, etc., can be embedded in the PDF as a result, harm your system, right? So now in this case, it is very easy because this is obviously an email I should delete it. I should not even bother, okay? And but if you have somebody that's less knowledgeable in your organization, and then they happen to click on that, and then you start the attack, and then to your system, and then if you don't have a proper NTFS security set up, and then that person has a full right to your system. That basically meaning whoever take control of the system can do the full damage of your system. Okay, that can be pretty devastating. Okay, and then so typically attachment, right? And so people are afraid of opening attachment. But if the email comes with an HTML email, you see it right there. You don't need to open the attachment, and it cannot come with any virus. Okay, and then so security is really the main reason. So number one, people feel less like want to open the PDF unless it's from a trusting source, right? The second thing is I have seen email server being configured to block PDF file. Have you guys seen that before? Okay, and then so these are all the reasons why we are spending time, okay, developing the HTML, even though our HTML email is not customizable at the moment. But maybe one day we're gonna make it customizable. But at this moment, at least we take a step to do something about it. Okay, so that's really the main reason. Okay, I'm done with my presentation, and then so yeah. Say that again. I didn't get it. You just print out your email, basically. You don't have hard copy. You just print an email. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, I would say they would just print the email.
Yeah, print the email. The email just print out professionally. Of course, you know, the last one on the topic will say from who to who, subject, etc., and then you follow by the format. Okay. And we are going to take a break. I believe, okay, the next time we will start the next presentation at 1:45. So you guys still have 30 minutes. Okay, enjoy.